6 of the Special Committee on Canada-China Relations. Pursuant to the motion adopted Wednesday, September 23, 2020, the committee is meeting on its study of Canada-China relations. La réunion d'aujourd'hui est...
Today's meeting is a hybrid format, as the motion adopted on September 23rd says, and it is also televised and will be accessible on the website of the House of Commons.
I would like to outline a few rules to follow. Members and witnesses may speak in the official language of their choice. Interpretation services are available for this meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. If you are participating by video conference, please click on the microphone icon to unmute yourself. For the witness, who I think has probably appeared at committees before, he will know, I believe, that when one of the members is asking you questions, you don't have to wait for me to recognize you. Carrie, you can go ahead and answer the question. Je vous rappelle que toutes les interventions.
I would like to remind you that all the interventions of the members as well as the witnesses must go through the chair. Please talk slowly and clearly.
Phone should be on mute. I would now like to welcome Mr. Sean.
Je souhaite maintenant la bienvenue à M. Sean Stahl, directeur exécutif de la coordination de la politique sur la Chine au ministère des Affaires étrangères, du Commerce et du Développement. Merci d'être là. Vous avez 5 minutes pour vos propos liminaires.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am very pleased to have the opportunity to address the committee on the subject of Tibet today. First, permit me a disclaimer. The committee is asked to hear from an expert on Tibet from Global Affairs Canada. Unfortunately, the limited access Canadian officials have to the Tibet Autonomous Region in China means that few officials have first-hand experience with the situation in Tibet. Access to Tibet remains strictly controlled by the Chinese government, and on rare occasions when official visits are allowed, they are highly scripted. In recent years, Tibet's central government has made it more difficult for diplomats, journalists, and foreigners overall to visit. A travel permit and an invitation is necessary. Canada consistently and frequently requests visits to the Tibet Autonomous Region. Permits to visit Tibetan regions in other Chinese provinces are not required, but those visits can also be heavily restricted. This session is particularly timely. Canada's ambassador to China, Dominic Barton, just returned from a visit to the Tibetan capital of Lhasa and nearby Shannan Prefecture at the invitation of the Chinese government. The trip was with a group of other diplomats and took place from October 26th to 30th. This was the first visit by a Canadian official since 2015. The lack of meaningful access to Tibet is one aspect of severe restrictions imposed by Chinese authorities on the Tibetan people. The government of Canada remains deeply concerned about the human rights situation affecting Tibetans, in line with reports such as those by NGOs and by the UN Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Human rights issues include restrictions on freedom of expression and freedom of religion or belief, and the protection of linguistic and cultural rights. We maintain engagement with members of the Tibetan diaspora, including Tibetan Canadians, and organizations that study and conduct and support the Tibetan community abroad. Contact with this community remains important to the Government of Canada and informs our approach to advocacy for rights and freedoms in Tibet. Canada bestowed honorary Canadian citizenship on Tibetan spiritual leader, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama in 2006. While we know there are long-standing grievances between the Chinese government and the Central Tibetan Administration, or government in exile, and His Holiness, Canada supports meaningful dialogue between these parties toward a resolution of issues acceptable to both sides. Although tensions between the Chinese government and Tibetans have remained high and ongoing over several decades, the last 10 years are no exception. The government continued to intensify its crackdown on Tibetans with increased surveillance and forced patriotic education. Acts of protests by Tibetans could result in detention or worse. To the world's horror, there have been more than 150 self-immolations by Tibetan Buddhists during this period. Canada has a long history of support for Tibetans. The government began work to resettle some of the first Tibetan refugees to Canada in the 1970s. There have certainly been more immigrants and refugees since that time. Within the last decade, the government of Canada established special measures to facilitate the private sponsorship and immigration of up to 1,000 displaced Tibetans from India. Individuals were matched with sponsors through Project Tibet Society, with a settlement of 1,000 refugees completed in 2017. These Tibetans and more than 7,000 others, in fact, according to the 2016 census, there were over 8,000 Canadians identifying as Tibetan, are contributing to our country's multilateral fabric, including participation in public life. In line with diplomatic relations, Canada recognizes the People's Republic of China as the governing body of the Tibet Autonomous Region. In line with China's own constitution and its international obligations, we call on the government to respect religious freedoms and end repressive policies in Tibet. While there is economic development in Tibet, it does not mask the need for the protection of political and civil rights. Canada will continue to ask for unhindered access to the region, especially in light of the recent crackdowns. And although there's increased attention being paid on the crackdown in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, we must not forget the situation in Tibet remains very serious. I thank the committee for raising this issue tonight.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stile. And now we'll go to our first round of questions, led off by Mr. Williamson for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just give me 1 minute, please, or 1 second here.
I paused.
Oh, thank you. All this technology.
All right.
Thank you. So thank you very much for appearing tonight. And I must say you paint a rather bleak picture of the situation in Tibet, and not only for the people of Tibet, but also for our government's ability to monitor, to participate, and to just get a sense of what's happening on the ground there. A few months ago, in August, this committee heard from Dr. Lobsang Sangay, who is the president of I'll refer to him as the Tibetans abroad, or the Tibetan diaspora outside of the territory, and he talked about the middle way approach as a way to perhaps reconcile his people's way of life within mainland China's, and it was, quote, to seek a genuine autonomy for the Tibetan people within the framework of the Chinese Constitution. Could you talk a little bit about the government of Canada's position on this middle way approach, and any work that's been done to facilitate it or to move it forward?
Indeed, very much aware of the Central Tibetan Administration's proposal for a middle way approach, one that we understand sets aside questions of independence, but rather seeks that greater autonomy within China. And just underline that from the Canadian policy, we recognize that the People's Republic of China is the governing body over the Tibetan Autonomous Region. We don't take a particular position on the middle way approach, but have consistently advocated for the government of China to engage in meaningful dialogue with the Dalai Lama and his representatives in the Central Tibetan Administration. The content of that dialogue we haven't taken a position on, but certainly we recognize that the middle way approach does refute the complaint that we often hear from the Chinese government that the Dalai Lama and his, I quote, clique are separatists and troublemakers trying to split the country. If they were to listen to what Lobsang Sangay and others are saying about the middle way approach, they would recognize that splitting the country is not what they're looking for.
Right. No, I think that's it. And it seems that Canada's policy towards Tibet really hasn't changed very much since the Mulroney government. It has been an acknowledgement or recognition that Tibet is part of mainland China. Is that accurate, or am I missing something? Has there been an evolution in the view of the Tibetan region in that time, or has it been a pretty consistent policy that states what I just said?
Mr. Chair, I think that's actually quite accurate. I don't think that there's been a significant shift in Canada's policy and approach over time. And I may be called out for, speaking harshly by the Chinese government about our position on that, but it's not the Canadian government policy so much that has changed over time. It's been the People's Republic of China's policy that's changed over time. And we've seen an increasing crackdown and limits of rights.
Well, I think that's exactly it. Whether it's a failure to live up to its side of the bargain agreement, which of course is something we've seen more and more, not just in Tibet but elsewhere. In fact, in a July 7th, 2020 interview with Agence France Presse, Dr. Sangay compared China's failure to uphold the 17-point agreement with Tibet to the imposition of the national security law in Hong Kong. He warned that, quote, "what you see in Hong Kong already took place in Tibet," end quote. What do you think what do you think are the parallels between Tibet and China's other autonomous regions?
Well, I think the trend lines that we've seen in Tibet have been shown in other regions of China as well. You mentioned some of the history there. I think, in more recent history, even I could say since 2008, there was a violent crackdown on protests that was followed over the last decade in a much harsher mechanisms of control and surveillance in Tibet. And some of the patterns of those mechanisms of control now we're seeing reproduced in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, for example.
Yeah,
and it really comes out to a less and less space for opposition to the Communist Party.
Yeah, no,
only,
and I
only
actually,
5 seconds, Mr.
yeah,
Williamson.
No, I'll just make a comment. I actually was in Tibet in 2007, and I got a firsthand taste of just how complete the Chinese control of the media is there. I was talking with many Tibetans who look for news, and the young generation that I had spoke to there had no knowledge, no information on the Tiananmen Square massacre, which shocked me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Williamson.
Thank you.
I think we were all interested to hear that story, but I shouldn't have let you go on beyond 6 minutes, so hope members will forgive me for that. I'll go on now to Mr. Fragiskatis for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Mr. Style for his testimony tonight. Mr. Style, could you explore a little more, or not explore, rather, share with the committee a little bit more about the ambassador's recent trip in Tibet and what exactly he did?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to give kind of broad strokes on the visit. The ambassador, of course, would be better placed himself to go into some of the details and nuances of that. But yeah, as I mentioned, we've been campaigning with the Chinese authorities very consistently for a visit, and his was the first in 5 years of any Canadian diplomat. I think the previous ambassador was even longer than that, perhaps 2013. So his visit was with a group of other diplomats. It followed on, other countries also have restrictions on visits as well. And there had been an earlier visit of diplomats and other ambassadors from other countries in September. And I believe this is the second visit in relatively short succession. Okay. He traveled to primarily Lhasa, the capital, but also was able to see parts of the surrounding prefecture of Shannan. He was able to visit a monastery, a school, meet with senior officials of the Tibetan government and visit some of the regions outside of Lhasa. But again, a highly scripted visit. I think it did afford him the opportunity to make, some personal observations with the limited free time he had to make some contact with ordinary Tibetans. And that for us, I think, is tremendous value. I think we're always concerned about as we say, the instrumentalization of these visits being used for propaganda purposes and these sorts of things. But you balance that out with the rare opportunity for firsthand observation, and also the very important opportunity for Canada and its government to show Tibetans that we're there, that we care, just his presence there.
Thank you. A rare opportunity indeed. Do you think this committee would benefit, Mr. Style, from having the ambassador appear and testify and share information and take questions on the recent visit to Tibet?
Yes, absolutely. I had the chance to be briefed very briefly by him as well. And I think the nuances and the observations he would be able to provide on his visit would be very helpful, especially given that these visits are so rare.
Thank you very much. The other question I wanted to ask Mr. Style is, how does Canada's approach to the Tibetan question compare and contrast to the approach taken by other middle powers, other middle power democracies, whether it is Australia or New Zealand or the UK? I won't fill in all the examples of middle powers that we could point to, but could you offer any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, sure. I think our position is quite similar, and I should note that increasingly coordinated. So we have the opportunity at working level and at higher levels all the way up to the minister to engage with our like-minded democracies on some of these critical issues to ensure that we're not missing important parts of our approach and our advocacy, and where we can coordinating that advocacy. Of course, we're also not alone in suffering some of the consequences for that advocacy. And I think there would be a long list of, as you say, middle powers and friendly democracies who have been punished at one time or another for permitting the Dalai Lama to visit, for example. I think many of us have been through periods where we've suffered the wrath of the Chinese government for engaging with Tibet.
Final question, Mr. Style. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I see I have a couple minutes. And this is a more general question regarding China's approach to Tibet. I know from other conflicts, not well versed in this one, I must admit, so thank you to the analysts of the Library of Parliament for their always very learned analysis, and I've relied on it. But I do know from a conflict that I have studied in the past, the Kurdish question, that one of the ways that Turkey, Iraq, and Iran integrated Kurdish dissidents into the state structure was to appoint them to high-level positions of authority. Is that something that the Chinese state has also done to sort of dissipate dissent within Tibet and among Tibetans?
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair assessment in this case. And in fact, I was listened to Lobsang Sangay's testimony before the committee as well, and I know that that's a point he's drawn, is that the co-option of the elites can be a factor. I think in the People's Republic of China, politically overall, there's very, very few Tibetans who make it to high-level positions within that system. But certainly within the Tibetan Autonomous Region, you see a mix of Han, ethnic Han, and ethnic Tibetan leaders within the political system.
15 seconds.
Oh, no, I was just simply going to thank the witness very much, and I've had the chance to engage with him on other issues relating to Canada's foreign policy in previous meetings at the committee level, Mr. Chair. We're very fortunate to have him here tonight.
Thank you. Monsieur Bergeron, 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks to our witness for being with us, Mr. Style, for being with us so late in the evening. We are happy not to be alone working at this kind of hour. Further to the appearance of Mr. Sangay at the committee a few weeks ago, you know that the committee prepared a report that was filed in the House of Commons. What was the follow-up from Global Affairs to this motion by this committee and filed at the House of Commons?
Indeed, we took note of the motion passed by the committee to encourage dialogue, and that is a motion that is entirely consistent with the government's policy. I want to congratulate the committee for making the motion, because although we take opportunities to advance that position when we speak with the Chinese government, on the opportunities that we have to raise these issues, I think it's important for the Chinese government to recognize that it's not just the government, but it's our parliament who supports that position.
Justement, par rapport à cette motion qui est un appel...
Yes, about this motion for dialogue, there is something that destabilizing to all of us. How is it that considering this willingness of Tibetans to go to this dialogue, there is such a refusal from Beijing's part? How do you consider Global Affairs' reaction to negate this possibility of dialogue and for concluding a new agreement?
How constructive of its positions and policies in places like Tibet. I think from a foreign policy perspective, it's important for us to maintain consistency in our approach and to continue to push these issues. I think the argument that is being put forward by the Chinese government not to engage in dialogue has only become hardened over time. And it's difficult given that rigidity for the government to find a way to back out slowly and find a new way, more flexibility in their position. I think we can only hope that by maintaining our own consistent policy, by pushing this as a potential solution, that there will be at some point an opening that would allow the Chinese government to set aside this very rigid position and engage some sort of dialogue. And it wouldn't be the first time. I mean, the Dalai Lama has had, back to the 50s, did engage with Chairman Mao. It was only after the uprising in 1959 when I think the Tibetan community said enough is enough, and the Dalai Lama fled, that dialogue ceased. But there have to be opportunities for increased dialogue in the future, and we truly believe that is the best way to ensure the stability within Tibet, within China, and the welfare of Tibetans both within and outside China.
Je sais que ça a été abordé par...
This was mentioned by colleagues, but Mr. Sangay told us that the 17-point agreement and the failure of the 17-point agreement foreshadowed the failure of this one country, two systems, or two countries, one system. One country, two systems. And that could foreshadow the failure of any potential agreement concerning Taiwan. How do you think things would come to pass? You talked about hope. Have you looked at our discussions and with regard to Buddhism, we've been told that hope is at the heart of Buddhism, and so we have to continue with this emphasis on being positive, on hope. But I'm a bit skeptical that we can base our hopes on being positive and maintaining hope for the time being. I'm sorry, but your 6 minutes are over. I hope that in your next turn you'll be able to answer or ask questions or follow up this question. Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron.
Or I know it's I think it's 8:33 now in Newfoundland and Labrador, where we have Mr. Harris for the next 6 minutes. Mr. Harris, please.
Thank you, Chair. And yes, it is 8:30 here now, so we're a little later. Nevertheless, I'm interested in asking Mr. Stahl some questions. We had a very interesting meeting with Dr. Sanjay, and one of the things remarkable about his views, especially towards the end after talking about all the difficulties, was his great optimism that eventually he believed that the future for the Tibetan Autonomous Region and the people of Tibet was going to be positive. So I think that's a encouragement to the rest of us to share that hope and also work towards it in any way that we can facilitate the process. I thought that there was an opportunity not so long ago, that the possibility of discussions to start, but that didn't take off. Do you know anything about that a couple of years ago?
I'm not immediately aware, Mr. Chair, of openings for dialogue. I think there had been during the period of Hu Jintao, so going back before Xi Jinping became president, that there had been some openings. Hu Jintao, former president of China, had had some connections, I believe, with the Tibetan region, but I'm not aware of anything concrete that has come out recently. No.
Okay, well, leaving that aside, we have had, we supported the whole idea of the middle way and working towards autonomy within the Chinese constitution. Do you know what that may mean in terms of the Chinese constitution? Do you know what an autonomous region actually consists of under the Chinese constitution? And what one would expect under the existing constitution?
Yeah, within Chinese law at the moment, autonomous regions, of which there are a few, do have some provision for self-government and self-say in the way that they operate. It also provides for, notionally within the Chinese constitution, freedom of religion and freedom of belief. I think the Chinese officials will tell you, well, yes, we have all of that in Tibet, as long as it's in accordance with other aspects of the law. And then they may point to you the very broad notion of national security law, for example, which forbids anything resembling sedition. Now, I know the committee's been studying Hong Kong and the national security law there, so you've got a good idea about that broad definition of national security, which in some senses will trump those other provisions of the Constitution and law that allows for religious freedom, for example.
So some of our colleagues have asked about freedom of the press and freedom of religion. In the Chinese context, does that, to my knowledge, is not a Chinese-wide phenomenon. although they have it in their constitution. Would you care to comment on that? Is there something particular about how this is approached in Tibet, or was there an expectation greater that they would, by virtue of being an autonomous region, expect greater freedoms?
Well, everything, even within the autonomous regions, is increasingly subject to the guidance and the supervision of the Communist Party of China. So that conception of autonomy would be quite different from, I think, what a common understanding of autonomy would be. I mean, there's no electoral process to participate in. Any leadership of the Tibetan Autonomous Region must be vetted through the Communist Party system. And as just one example, if you want to be a Communist Party member, you're forbidden from practicing religion. And so in a Tibetan region, it excludes many people who would want to be involved in any sort of political process.
So that may be a function of political activity elsewhere in China, but because of the nature of that, the Communist Party membership are the ones who are in control. But if religion prevents you, then you aren't able to exercise any autonomy. Is that the way it works?
I'm not sure it would be quite so cut and dried. But I think there's all sorts of formal and informal blockages to true autonomy. And if I can give an example, just in terms of not the political sphere, but even the economic sphere, most of the investment into Tibet, and yes, there are statistically higher rates of GDP growth in Tibet, but most of that is the result of investment from outside Tibet, often through state-owned enterprises, which has created, some say, a closed loop of economic benefit, so that the Tibetans themselves, who had been at least provisionally and historically nomads, are cut out of that economic loop.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Harris.
Excuse me, Chair. Point of order. I'm unable to hear anything you're saying, Chair.
I'm sorry, Mr. Harris, because I should have learned by now. When does one learn to unmute when one should? Sorry about that. Yeah, that's your 6 minutes. Thanks very much for concluding on time without hearing me. Maintenant, on va procéder au 12e tour.
We will now go to a second round with Mr. Paulus. Thank you very much, Chairman. Hello, Mr. Steele. My first question concerning a company, a Chinese company, Nasdaq, which provides surveillance materials in Xinjiang. And we know that they're very present. And do you know if they use their same surveillance equipment and techniques in Tibet?
But it does not ring any immediate bells. It may be something I'd have to get back to the committee on.
Okay, c'est la compagnie Noctec.
C'est Noctec. Does that mean anything to you? Yeah.
As that's high on the agenda for parliamentary committees at the moment. Yeah, I don't have any firsthand knowledge on the company itself and its activities elsewhere. So I'm afraid I can't comment, but I would be certainly pleased to consult with some of my colleagues who watch that a bit more closely than I do and get back to the committee.
Okay. J'aimerais savoir, selon...
I'd like to know whether right now in Tibet, in the work camps, do you think that it can happen that the equipment, protection equipment, PPE, things like that, that might have been made in work camps without our knowing it. Is that a possibility?
There's been increasing reports about labor camps in China and the potential for the use of forced labor. Many of those reports, of course, have been linked to this situation for Uyghurs in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. But I think, as the member points out, there's also been reports of labor camps being set up in Tibet. There's less information about what's happening in terms of labor internment camps in Tibet, but we do know even before this period that forced resettlement off nomadic lands, relocation of Tibetans who were traditionally working off the land as nomads or shepherds to make way for mining projects or for infrastructure projects or for other purposes, and then having them retrained and put into factory jobs. There seems to be significant evidence to suggest that has taken place and continues to take place in Tibet as well.
Donc, malheureusement,
So unfortunately, we might well think that the equipment bought by the Canadian government could have been made in these work camps, something that could happen. And the other question I wanted to ask, we know that Canada has made some remarks that have upset the Chinese embassy and authorities, and concerning the safety of people who are the embassy who go to Tibet or China, is something to ensure their security and safety.
Well, I think for Tibet in particular, the major concern that we have is less for the safety of the diplomats who travel there, but the surveillance that they're under when they do. In Tibet, and I think the ambassador would to attest this, it's very difficult to break away from your handlers and the constant surveillance you might have. And I would note that I mentioned it in my opening remarks that you're not required permits for travel to Tibetan areas outside of Tibet in places like Sichuan province or Qinghai province. We've noted that historically, when diplomats do travel there, they are indeed under surveillance and followed when they're there.
est-ce que vous trouvez ça normal?
Do you find it normal that ambassadors, diplomats, journalists be under such surveillance, whereas members of the Communist Party can come to Canada and go around as they please here?
A 5-second answer, Mr. Style.
No, I wouldn't find that normal.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup, Mr. Paulus.
Thank you, Mr. Paulus.
Mr. Varani for 5 minutes. Welcome, Mr. Varani.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to ask some generalized questions, and I apologize for having not heard the first part of the witnesses' exchange, but some generalized questions about the state of the Sino-Tibetan dialogue from your perspective, Mr. Stiles. So we know that dialogue was ongoing for a certain amount of time, from about the mid-2000s to about the end of the 2000s, and then around 2010 it sort of came to a standstill. Do you have can you give us a sense of your understanding of the blockages in restarting the Sino-Tibetan dialogue and the importance of discussions about the middle way approach, which is the approach that you'll be aware, obviously, that His Holiness espouses to ensure that there is a compromise between the perceptions of Tibetan independence and versus the notion of complete being subsumed within the Chinese Federation, but establishing a compromise which looks a lot like the way the Canadian Federation is established, where you just have a region that has greater linguistic, cultural, and religious autonomy, but within the broader Chinese Federation and broader Chinese Constitution. So could you give us an update on that piece and your understanding of it from the GAC perspective?
Certainly, I think as I indicated before, that there's reason to be pessimistic about the openness of the People's Republic of China to engage in that dialogue at the moment. The signs are not there, at least as we see them. And it would be lovely to think that somewhere behind the scenes that harsh exterior and rigidity in the government's position is a little bit more open to dialogue, and we just haven't seen it. And the opposition to the Dalai Lama and the Sikyong, Lobsang Sangye himself, just tells us that there's not a lot of appetite. So every time that Lobsang Sangye visits Canada, as he did or even doesn't visit but participates virtually, I suppose in the last case, we receive protestations and representations from the Chinese authorities, complaining that we are engaging with a separatist and a terrorist. I've met Mr. Sangye myself. But each time that he does in the past, even travel to China, the Chinese ask us to deny a visa, and how could we possibly do this? So there's, that may be the harsh exterior of the official position that we're seeing, and that there's a more openness somewhere. But all of the signals that we get, whether it's directly around Tibet or around Xinjiang or Hong Kong for that matter, seem to suggest that the emphasis on stability and security and brooking absolutely no compromise in the unified leadership of the Communist Party suggests that the time is not nigh for an opening in that dialogue.
Okay, so let me take it from a different angle. So there's an argument about sort of asserting human rights protections and basic defensive statutory rules or norms that exist on the books in China itself. So things like the language of instruction in the Tibetan Autonomous Region. There are rules about ethnic minorities and about the language of instruction, which actually on paper look like they could be somewhat robust, might not be the best word, but they could be somewhat rigorous in terms of ensuring that the Tibetan is a language of instruction in the Tibetan Autonomous Region. What is your understanding from the GAC perspective about Chinese compliance with Chinese rules themselves as they're outlined in the Tibetan Autonomous Region? The language of instruction is a critical one, not just for language activists like Tashi Wangchuk, and I appreciate the government has made representations about that, but it's an important piece for the Canada-Tibet committee that operates here and advocates for at least observing the laws that are on the books in China. So language of instruction and that sort of strategy, can you comment on that piece?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, and this is one of the bases we have on which to advocate. I mean, it's one thing which we always do to appeal to international norms and universal human rights on these issues, but in fact, it's the Chinese own laws that provide a basis for respect of linguistic and cultural rights and religious freedoms. But as I said, the trends aren't great. So just to give you an example, I mean, this has been broader than Tibet, but there's been reinterpretation of bilingual education in China, including in Mongolia, but also in Tibet. And I'm getting the sign here, but there's certainly more that could be done according to the Chinese law.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Thank you, Mr. Varani. Et maintenant, pendant 2 minutes.
And now for 2 minutes and 30 seconds, Mr. Bergeron. Yes, Mr. Chairman, let's come back briefly on the failure of the 17-point agreement, and this is also what happened to the integration of Taiwan and one state, two systems, and Mr. Virani touched on the issue of hope. Are we being powerless here, looking on what is happening, or is there a concerted action from the international community to force a change, to operate a change, to make China change things?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I appreciate having a chance to address the question. I think there's an issue that's rightly pointed out here, is that China has to come to an understanding, its government has to come to an understanding that if it wants the international community to accept it at its word, it has to fulfill its word. And so, you know, the 17-point agreement, long before Canada established diplomatic relations with China, so difficult for us to use as a basis for holding them to account. But certainly, in the case of Hong Kong, as you've mentioned, the Sino-British Joint Declaration, a UN-registered treaty, the violation of the obligations under that treaty give us pause, and China has to realize that that behavior has consequences for the trust that the international community will bestow upon it.
Très rapidement, Monsieur le Président.
Quickly, because I see that you're signaling me, there's a project of a train link that was announced by Xi Jinping himself in Tibet, in the autonomous region. How do you see this new project? Is the objective here to develop Tibet? This link will be close to the Indian border.
Yeah, indeed, and I think there's views on both sides. One, that this will bring more economic opportunity for Tibetans, but two, that it will hasten the speed of cultural assimilation into Tibet. And it would be more clear to us which it was if Tibetans themselves had freedom to move in and out of Tibet, which they do not.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Mr. Bergeron.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. Thank you, Mr. Style.
Harris, for 2.5 minutes, please.
Again, I didn't hear you, Chair, but I assume you were giving me 2.5 minutes. So
I was. That time I
Mr.
wasn't muted, but please go ahead. I'll start you now.
Thank you. Mr. Style, you did a disclaimer at the beginning saying that you weren't the Tibet expert. So I'll ask you this: does Global Affairs have any expertise in the area of Quebec? Do they have people with knowledge? I see some, general comments, but also saying we don't know very much about what's going on. So, do we know anything about migration patterns, about population, about people from mainland or the rest of China being brought into Tibet? Are these speculation? Are these based on other people's information? What is the state of knowledge within Global Affairs about this, or are we relying on CIA nation reports?
So in terms of, a cultural or linguistic expert, we have within Global Affairs Canada, as we do throughout the country, employees of Tibetan origin. But in terms of understanding the actual situation on the ground, I think all of us, including those who study Tibet on a more or less full-time basis, rely at least in part on official Chinese statistics, the reliability of which you can question, but that's what we have, whether it's statistics on economic growth, which suggests that Tibet's economy is growing much faster than the average, although from a low base, or if it's on population statistics, which tell us that approximately 90% of the population in Tibet, shrinking slowly, is Tibetan versus, for example, Han. And when we keep in mind things like that, you also have to remember that migrant labor is not necessarily counted in those official statistics, so they can be skewed.
Okay, I did ask questions about religion in my previous thing, but I did want to emphasize that that's totally separate from the notion that religion is being suppressed and the Buddhist monastery control is being suppressed actively by the government as well. Is that your understanding?
Yes, absolutely. And just to give you one example, the Sera Monastery in Lhasa has the capacity for 2,000 monks. According to reporting that we've collected just to compare over the years, in 2015, there were 600 monks. When Ambassador Barton visited, there were 400. And part of that is because compulsory education, including patriotic education, is required before young monks can go to the monastery. So the numbers have been dwindling.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Harris. I think we were all interested to hear that answer, I'm sure, as all of these answers. We'll go on now to Mr. Jennis for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Style. And I am going to go rapid fire here because I want to cover a number of different things. You said at the beginning that the government of Canada recognizes the PRC as the governing body of Tibet. And for me, that includes not only the Tibetan Autonomous Region, but historical Tibet, which is larger. To me, in that recognition, there's nothing controversial. That's just an identification of a political reality. And if it wasn't for that political reality, Tibetans would have no problem. So should I read anything else into that comment other than just you recognize the reality that the territory is controlled by the government of China at the present time?
No, you shouldn't read anything further than that. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, all right. Thank you. You had said that I think I heard you say to Mr. Bergeron that the motion that was passed is consistent with government policy. The motion that we passed expressed support for dialogue towards the establishment of the middle way, genuine autonomy for Tibet within the framework of the Chinese constitution. Is the motion in its entirety, I just want to be clear, is the motion in its entirety dialogue with the view to genuine autonomy, is that consistent with government policy?
Mr. Chair, I should probably clarify my position, and if I misread or misremembered the motion, the Canadian policy does not include a specific reference to the middle way. It only refers to our advocacy for dialogue without specifying the content.
Okay, so that's the current government position. It's not to oppose the middle way. It's not to support it. It's to support dialogue in a and that's kind of where it stops. Okay.
To a mutual, as we often would say, as a resolution to the grievances that are acceptable by both sides.
Right. We speak a lot about the human rights of people in Tibet, but I think there's an important distinction to speak about the rights of people in Tibet and the rights of Tibetans as a people. And I wonder if the government of Canada views Tibetans as a collective of having certain rights as a people, and if so, what those rights would be.
Mr. Chair, that's an excellent point to raise because, as the committee knows, there's a large population of Tibetans living outside of the Tibetan Autonomous Region, including in India. I think in the best way that I can put this is that our concern for the humanitarian, cultural, and linguistic rights extends to the entire Tibetan population, no matter where it rests.
Sorry, Mr. Style, if I can direct my question, I wasn't so much referring to the broader diaspora community, but when you speak about the rights of a people in their historic homeland, the implication is that they have rights of perhaps involving self-determination. They have rights that are different from the rights of just individuals. That they have people have certain political rights that are distinct. Would you see Tibetans as a people in that sense of having particular rights that are distinct, maybe from the rights of individuals vis-a-vis freedom and those sorts of things?
No, I don't think, in the sense of a political entity. And, I'm just trying to understand the question a little bit more clearly. But in terms of if it were to say, do we recognize the Central Tibetan Administration or the government in exile as a separate political entity, then the answer is no.
Okay. Yeah. And whether or not the CTA speaks for the Tibetan people is maybe a distinct question from whether the Tibetan people as a people have rights. But I mean, I think the question's been asked and answered, and feel free to clarify later on if you wish. I want to ask as well: does the government of Canada have a specific position around the reincarnation issue, the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, the Chinese government's efforts to rule on proposal that they would determine the reincarnation? Does the government of Canada have a position? Has the government of Canada made representations on those issues at all?
Mr. Chair, I'm grateful that particular question has been raised because it's an area of preoccupation not only for Canada but many of our like-minded partners. But but the position, if I can articulate it carefully here, is that we support the right of the Tibetan Buddhists themselves to choose their leader.
Okay. Are we seeing
Thank
any
you,
evidence
Mr.
of birth
Janis.
suppression in
Thanks.
Tibet, similar to what we're seeing in
Thanks.
Xinjiang? Oh,
Thanks,
sorry.
Mr. Janis. Thanks very much. We'll go on now to Ms. Zan for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, Mr. Stile. It's very interesting to hear your ideas about what is going on, and also would love to hear further about what life is like on the ground right now. Tibet has always been a country I would like to go to. In the past 30 years, would you say, as far as you know, there has been large-scale migration of Chinese settlers to the Tibetan region? Also, have standards of living changed and become better for people in the TAR over the past decade?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, to answer the question about standard of living, we often have to rely on Chinese statistics for economic growth and development. And by those measures, it's quite clear that economic standards of living have risen across the board. Our reporting would suggest that economic development over the last 30 years or even less has been unequally distributed. As I mentioned, a bit of a closed economic loop that happens there. And, I think there's, related to that, the issue of migration. There's, the inward movement. Yes, I think even the Chinese population statistics would acknowledge that there has been an influx of Chinese citizens from other regions of the country, primarily ethnic Hans, moving into Tibet. It's also difficult to determine exactly the numbers too, because there's been a history of even government officials, spending part of their time, their summers in Tibet, in Lhasa, and then moving and having their families reside in Chengdu and Sichuan in the plains, where it's a completely different climate and situation. So it's difficult to determine, according to the statistics, exactly how much in-migration there had been.
So is it considered like a vacation place? Is that why they go there? They have a place there and then they go back to work in the other part of China?
Well, I think it reflects the harsh realities of the climate at the top of the world,
Okay.
and the relative economic development. Many have commented about the sparse landscape. I mean, it's a very high elevation region where some people can have who are not well adapted to the low oxygen and the high elevation can have aggravated medical problems. So I think it's and the level of entertainment and urbanization is lower than other parts of China. So I think it's a preference for some to spend some of their time in places like Chengdu.
Thank you. So we've talked about some of the human rights issues, and how much would you say of the problems that the Chinese have with Tibet are because of religion versus ethnicity, or versus wanting independence? Obviously, we know a lot of communist governments do not believe in God, and they don't follow that kind of religion. And so I would imagine they probably have a problem with Buddhism as well. But how much of it is that and their fear of religion versus ethnicity or a desire for independence?
Mr. Chair, I think religion is a particular target for the Communist Party in China, and there's a long history of that. What we've started to see over the last several years is both, I would say, a signification of religion and a partification, if I can, of religion. So there are signs of even in, I'll use the example here of in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, the Central Asian minarets being torn down from mosques and replaced with pagoda style, Chinese style pagodas. But the more insidious part of it, I think, is the partification of it. So there are, including with Buddhism, there is a Buddhist association that is recognized and sanctioned by the Communist Party as the authority on Buddhism in China. Outside of that, there is no recognition. And we're seeing increasingly that party doctrine is becoming a requirement to be inserted into religious doctrine.
Right.
In all religions, including Buddhism.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Zan. Thank you very much, Mr. Stile. We really appreciate you appearing before the committee today. I think I can speak on behalf of all members in saying that. We're going to adjourn in a moment.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. Prajiskevich.
If I could, and I know that members are hearing your message of adjournment and probably want you to get on with it, but if I could raise to my colleagues the idea that we collectively come together and agree that inviting Ambassador Barton to come at a mutually convenient time for the committee and for him to answer questions about his recent visit to Tibet. As we heard, the first visit by a Canadian official since 2015. I think the committee would really benefit from that. And just wanting to put that idea forward, and perhaps we could decide on that tonight.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we do want to get on to the other subcommittee meeting, but I will ask if there are any opposed to that idea. Please so indicate. Mr. Harris, please. Sorry, you're muted.
Trying to figure out where to unmute. So, I mean, we're having a discussion about committee business coming up, but I guess it is in order. I'm not saying it's out of order, but it's the desire. Is that a motion for the committee now, or are you just seeking a consensus? I think we'd be interested, but
sounded like you seeking a consensus to me, Mr.
Seeking consensus first, yeah, and I think I mean we should have it, but if we don't, then I suppose we can introduce it as a motion.
Mr. Jennings.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea, and I think we should give the ambassador an opportunity to give us other updates that he sees fit as well, and allocate a sufficient amount of time for all of the above.
Mr. Williamson, did I see your hand up, or you're reaching for a pillow, perhaps? Like I'd like to be right now. Soon. All right, thank you. Merci beaucoup tout le monde.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, is that a consensus to proceed then?
I think it is,
okay,
and I think it's a direction to the subcommittee to try and work out the details, or to work with the clerk and so forth, and see what we can do in that regard. So I think that's the direction from the committee, as I take it. Thank you so much again, Mr. Stile. Thank you, members of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Stile.
À la prochaine. I'll see some of you in a few minutes, very shortly, at our subcommittee meeting. The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Stile.
Bye.